Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. Staff at the Museum of the American Indian are among those directed to review information and other materials the Trump administration says fosters national shame. They are told such information should be removed from public exhibits and programs. Native historians worry that's a step backward from decades of progress developing accurate information from a Native perspective. We'll hear about that this hour and talk about Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's announcement that soldiers who participated in the Wounded Knee Massacre will keep their medals. We'll be back after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. Across Canada, people mark the 5th National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, also known as Orange Shirt Day. Prime Minister Mark Carney reflected on the tragic legacy of the residential school system and talked about how his government is moving toward reconciliation. But as Dan Karpenchuk reports, the country's Governor General says more work remains.
There were rallies, ceremonies, and speeches, with, in many communities, a sea of orange shirts. And there were celebrations of Indigenous music, language, art, and culture. And most importantly, there was time to reflect on the past abuses of the residential schools. In Ottawa, at one of the events, Prime Minister Mark Carney addressed the crowd.
Truth is the foundation of justice. And the truth is, for more than a century, this country ran residential schools. Over 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were taken from their families and their communities, torn from their languages, their cultures, and their identities. On this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we honor survivors and the children who never returned home. We reflect on the devastating legacy of the residential school system. And we, as a government and as a people, we match remembrance with responsibility.
It's been nearly 10 years since the recommendations from the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There were 94 directives after hearing from thousands of residential school survivors who told their personal stories of pain and tragedy. Carney says his government remains committed to advancing the work of that commission. Governor General Mary Simon, who is Indigenous, says some progress has taken place, but much work remains.
Inequities persist, and we share a lifelong responsibility to address them. I have seen Indigenous people striving to heal while still struggling to meet basic needs. Too often, they lack access to adequate trauma-informed mental health support that honors their traditional healing practices. So today, I call on every Canadian to renew their commitment to reconciliation.
Simon says she sees a world where young Indigenous people can embrace being Canadian without compromising their identity. For National Native News, I'm Dan Karpenchuk.
In the U.S., Orange Shirt Day events also took place, including at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas. The university was originally established as an Indian boarding school. Current Haskell senior Denise Flores Frazier gave out ribbons in remembrance of children who attended the Haskell Institute and never returned home.
We created pins with the names of each 150 children that were discovered here at Haskell Indian Nations University. We put out their tribes and a little website link so that people can find if they have a relative here or if they just wanted to know more information about some of the children here, like the ages that they passed or their time here at Haskell. We're also leaving notes so that they can write letters to them. They won't be left at the graveyard, and we're not reading them. We're just collecting them in case people have anything they want to say to the children.
The sorority chapter of Gamma Delta Pi hosted the event. Other events on campus included a remembrance walk and an open mic and panel night to provide people the opportunity to share stories. The National Congress of American Indians has a list of resources available for tribes and hosted a webinar this week ahead of the federal government shutdown to discuss tribal funding, Indian affairs, and critical services. Webinar speakers discussed contingency plans, saying most tribal programs will be impacted, which could include funding disruptions. The government shut down midnight on Wednesday. I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Support for journalism that raises the awareness of child well-being to citizens and to policymakers provided by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, building a brighter future for children, families, and communities. Information at aecf.org.
Support by Sonosky Chambers Law, championing tribal sovereignty and Native American rights since 1976. From opioids litigation to treaty rights to tribal self-governance. With offices in Washington, D.C., New Mexico, California, and Alaska. Sonosky Chambers Law.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. The National Museum of the American Indian is closed today, along with all other federally supported institutions that are deemed non-essential during the government shutdown. When it reopens, Native historians and culture keepers will be closely watching exhibits, programs, and public information for changes. As a review mandated by President Donald Trump aims to purge what he calls derisive or partisan narratives. The presentations at NMAI and other institutions reflect decades of work and persistence to accurately include Native perspectives in history, education, and the arts. We'll get a view of what's going on from two people with extensive knowledge about the mission and purpose of NMAI. Also, this hour, we'll get perspectives on Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's announcement that the U.S. cavalry soldiers who took part in the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre will keep their medals of honor. You can join today's conversation. Just call us at 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Suzanne Schoen Harjo. She is the president of the Morningstar Institute, a founding trustee of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, and recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She is Cheyenne and Hodolgi Muskogee. Suzanne, hello, and welcome back to Native America Calling.
Hi, Sean. Glad to be back.
Great to have you, Suzanne. We also have Rick West on the show today. He is the founding director and director emeritus of the National Museum of the American Indian and CEO and director emeritus of the Autry Museum of the American West. He joins us from Los Angeles, California. Good morning, Rick. Pleasure to have you on the show as well.
Thank you so much. We're glad to be here.
And also on the show today, we have O.J. Siemens Sr. He is the co-executive director of Four Directions Vote. He is Rosebud Sioux. O.J., hello, and welcome back to the show.
Good afternoon, and thank you. I always enjoy being a part of this show, so I look forward to listening to everybody and have a good conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely. We always enjoy having you on the show, OJ, along with our other guests. And Suzanne, I want to begin with you. Please educate our listeners first and foremost. What insights do you have in terms of what types of exhibits, displays, presentations, or other information or resources are currently being reviewed or will be reviewed soon at NMAI, and what could possibly change?
Well, my part of this was getting the museum, working on that for 20-some years, and until we got the law passed, and then being a founding trustee of the new museum, new in 1990, and today, and being the chair of the program committee then, which was also included the exhibits, all the opening exhibits. But my role in current exhibits, it ended really with the opening of the National Museum of the American Indians exhibit called Nation to Nation: Treaties between the United States and American Indian Nations. And that opened in 2014, and it continues through 2027. And will close January 2028. So that exhibit is one, I presume, that is being evaluated, although there's nothing that I know of to replace it if that were to be the decision. But I think a look at that particular exhibit, which I had the privilege of curating, will show to anyone looking at it with an objective view, will show what we were trying to present and what the Smithsonian does so well and what the Indian Museum does so well, which is to put things in context and to show what people were thinking, what peoples were thinking when they were doing things. One of the canons of U.S. law is what did the Indians at the time of treaty making think they were entering into? What did they think? And we extended that with the treaties exhibit to what our original title for it was Treaties, Great Nations in Their Own Words. And that was what I originally proposed. And that was its working title for a long time until we went with the Nation to Nation better title, because we're really talking about diplomacy between and among nations, and and the recognition of inherent sovereignty of each through the treaties. So what we did was to show what the United States wanted, what the young United States wanted, what the venerated nations wanted, and what each was thought they were doing at the time. And it's easy for someone looking at it that way to say, oh, here's where the misunderstandings came in, here's where the conflict was, here's where this might not have been resolved, or this is quite clear, and why did misunderstandings arise, or what happened from there. So this is the thing that I hope doesn't get lost in, not just for the show I curated, but for the whole of what the National Museum of the American Indian tries to do, which is to examine points in history and to try to educate and enlighten the people who are coming to the museum. And if you don't know treaties, if you don't know Native American histories, if you don't know about inherent sovereignty of Native nations, you just don't know the history of the United States. And now more than ever, with the 250th anniversary coming up, people should really take a look at the origins of the U.S. and what continues today. These relationships continue today. Treaties are valid today. So I hope none of that gets lost in people looking for the boogeyman of DEI, because this isn't that. We're not a racial classification. We're political entities. We're policy entities, and that's why we say nation to nation.
Suzanne, the claims of the presidential administration that information at the museum could portray Americans in a poor light. Can you think of any specific information from the exhibit that you curated, Nation to Nation, Treaties Between the United States and American Indian Nations, or any other types of presentations or displays there at the Smithsonian that someone could point to and say, geez, that's what he's talking about. That's what could potentially paint Americans in a poor light. Can you point to anything along those lines?
I cannot. Actually, it, on balance, looks at the United States as what it is, a shining example of democracy, and looks at it for what it hopes to be as a nation in progress. And what our exhibit shows is that we're all in progress. And where we have leaders, where we have various influences that veer us off course, and cause conflict here and there. We maneuvered through it. This is nothing we haven't seen before. We have seen this before. We've been through it before. We've been through Manifest Destiny before, where people thought this was an empty part of the planet and didn't even know it was a planet. Just thought God made this place for the white people of Europe, and that how far everyone has come and how far the United States has progressed from its infancy to now, and where things can go horribly wrong, where things can be catastrophic for people at a given time, and then what happens when people try to correct that and to say, let's go back to what we thought we knew. Where were we on firm footing? And that's what diplomacy does. That's what long-term relationships do. And our long-term relationship with the United States is that the United States is our ally. And we have to keep that in mind. And the United States leadership, no matter what office they're in, from the school board to the presidency, need to keep in mind that our treaties that are binding are treaties of peace and friendship forever. Mm-hmm. And where they've gone off course is something that has bedeviled the people who look at these things and say, how could that have happened? How could it have happened so fast? And the way that everyone has corrected that course. We're not talking about people who are woke or not woke, or we're talking about people who understand that you follow a certain negative course and that's destructive for everyone. The bully doesn't survive bullying, and the victim doesn't survive bullying. But once in a while, you have a way out of that kind of construct and a way through it. And that's, I think, the value of the Smithsonian, and why, when we were negotiating the future of that fabulous collection of the Museum of the American Indian, we selected Smithsonian.
We're going to have to take our first break here, but we'll be right back and continue this conversation. Only if there's a government shutdown, tribes with government contracts, Native American federal employees, and anyone seeking health care at the Indian Health Service will be affected by the federal government shutdown. We'll take a look at who's affected and what the lasting impacts might be on the next Native America Calling.
Support provided by Amerind. Amerind is 100% tribally owned and partners with tribes and their businesses to provide affordable commercial insurance coverage, protect tribal sovereignty, and strengthen Native American communities by helping to keep dollars in Indian country. Information about property, liability, commercial auto, and workers' comp available at Amerind.com. That's AMERIND.com.
Thank you for tuning in today to Native America Calling. We're talking about revising history at Smithsonian museums like the National Museum of the American Indian. The president ordered a review to eliminate any displays that show Americans in an unfavorable light. How do you feel about that? Let us know. Give us a call. 1-800-996-2848. 1-800-996-2848. Give us a call. You can share your comments on the air. Let's speak now with Rick West. He is the founding director and director emeritus of the National Museum of the American Indian. And Rick, I'd like to continue where we left off with Suzanne. And what can you tell us about work being done by Smithsonian staff to change how Native Americans are portrayed at its various institutions?
Well, I think the National Museum of the American Indian is an example of a very positive step taken by the Smithsonian Institution that's very consistent with what that institution is. It is really a set of museums whose best effort is to make sure that we describe as complete a context, a historical context of this great country as we possibly can. And I think the National Museum of the American Indian was an effort to insert into that context, really, a voice that had been missing, at least on the museum front, if you will. The National Museum of the American Indian, through the work of people like founding trustee Suzanne and others, was very much an effort to put all the stories in play, if you will, as Suzanne has so aptly pointed out with respect to the treaties exhibit, which actually went public after I had left and retired from the National Museum of the American Indian, but was actually started during my regime as the founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian. And everything she says is true. We were trying to get all voices at the table to tell this story of American history and to show that it is part of that continuing effort of the United States to become the more perfect union. But in order to make sure you describe that journey completely, you have to make sure that all voices involved are at the table of representation and interpretation. Mm-hmm. So one of the founding objectives, mission objectives of the National Museum of the American Indian was that we rely on what is fact, and that is that Native peoples and communities know a great deal themselves about their own history, and that should be part of the interpretive thread that gets spun out at museums like the National Museum of the American Indian and in institutions like the Smithsonian Institution, whose effort is to pull all these threads of history and experience of the American experiment together in one place and at this institution. And I think that the National Museum of the American Indian has always done that. It is really not simply an institution of Native American history or Native history. It is very much a museum of American history. And in telling the full story, I think you have to tell the full story. Of course, there is much to celebrate about Native America in having come through the last 500 years and having a present and insisting on a future. But in telling that story, you can't simply wipe from history things that may have happened along the way on that sometimes tumultuous journey to a more perfect union.
Well, let's talk more about that, Rick, because I, like many of the people listening to the show right now, I've visited NMAI several times over the years, and there's just such an immense amount of information. I mean, so many different tribes, so many periods of history. Can you think of maybe perhaps specific types of Native exhibits or time periods or even events that could be targeted specifically with regard to these thoughts about what might project Americans in a bad light?
Well, I think that you can't look at that history and know that certain kinds of tragedies occurred in that journey. There's no question about that. I mean, I just reflect on the fact that from a demographic standpoint, there were probably tens of millions of Native people, indigenous people, in what is now the United States at the time of contact. When the first census that included Native people was conducted in 1900, their population was 250,000. What sits behind that tale is certainly history, which has its low points as far as Native people are concerned. I don't think you reject that story simply on that basis. You take it in context, as Suzanne explained in describing the treaties exhibit, as a piece of a longer journey. But you have to keep all the pieces on the table and in view in the telling of that tale. There is nothing ultimately negative about that. We have never claimed in this country to have a perfect union. We are trying to achieve a more perfect union. And you have to include all aspects of that story in the telling of the tale to make it complete.
Rick, what are you hearing from current and former NMAI staff?
Well, I think that there is a great deal of anxiety, honestly, and I can't say that I understand it, and I don't blame them. I think that there is a certain anxiety about what this kind of exercise means, kind of on the working level for people at the institution. I certainly am in touch with people and former colleagues of mine there. And I think that what we want to try to do is to convince people that what is going on at the National Museum of the American Indian and at the Smithsonian Institution, I think is something that remains laudable in telling this complete story of the history and experience of the American experiment. And I think that that is the way that it is still perceived by the public. There are any number of even public surveys which have been taken in light of the executive order which came down respecting the Smithsonian Institution and its exhibitions that indicate that that is the way the public still views the Smithsonian Institution, that there is balance and fairness in the presentations that occur at the museums that are in the Smithsonian system, whether it's the National Museum of American History, the National Museum of the American Indian, or the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
What can be done at this point? How do you see people moving forward, especially folks that are at the museum?
Well, I think that they continue to do the work that they have been doing since the museum was founded. There are many stories still to be told, and I think that what I want to emphasize is that the Smithsonian is the National Museum of the American Indian is not an effort that tries to create a new exclusivity. It is not imposing our views on everybody else. It is a new inclusivity. It is only trying to make sure that in telling stories of American experience and American history, we have all the voices at the table that were involved in that history and experience. And that's what I think should continue to be done at institutions throughout the Smithsonian Institution. I think that that's what keeps it sound for the future.
Rick, some people listening right now might think to themselves, well, if a museum accepts federal funding, perhaps it should also accept the will of the elected officials that provide that money. What's your response to someone with that opinion?
I don't think that's entirely consistent with the history of the Smithsonian Institution. If we look at how it was created in the 19th century because of a gift made by James Smithson to the United States and an arrangement set up in which the Smithsonian Institution operates as an independent agency. It is not part of the administration, anybody's administration. This administration or administrations from the past. It is run by the Board of Regents. The Board of Regents, in the statement released in June, I think indicated what their positioning was, and that is that decisions relating to policies of the institution were in the hands of the Board of Regents, the Chancellor of which is the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and then several both public members as well as representatives of the Congress. That's the governing body for the Smithsonian. And at their wish and at their hand, also the Secretary of the Smithsonian is the director of the institution. I think that's where you look to see who determines how the Smithsonian Institution should be operating.
Okay. Suzanne, I want to go back to you. And the president wants to restore, in his words, what he calls truth and sanity to American history, truth and sanity to American history. And he mentions past administrations that have rewritten history to advance what he says is corrosive and divisive ideology and instills a sense of national shame. Suzanne, what do you make of that? What's your thought?
Well, that's exactly what we try to portray those of us who have worked with content for the National Museum of the American Indian and those of us who are just supporters of it try to portray is history in its unprejudiced form. You say, what happened here? Let's look at this. What is happening now? Let's look at this. Are there foolish people in control sometimes of native nations, of the United States? Yes. Are there bad people? Yes. Are there good people? Yes. You have to look at the whole of it, as Rick West has said, in order to get an idea of the ultimate statement you're making. And what people don't understand generally, non-Native people, about Native America and Native peoples is that we have collective rights and responsibilities, and as nations, as tribes, as peoples, and we have individual rights and responsibilities like everyone else. We have dual citizenship in our nations and the United States, and then we have the treaties that bind and that have and centuries of laws that have bearing on our relationships. But these are long haul kinds of relationships, and the Native peoples have every reason to want the United States to succeed and always do better and better and better. And the same is true, the reverse should be true with all Americans, because if they start snatching programs away or say you can't have health care, then give us the land back. We gave up, and we weren't conquered. We gave up a lot of land for the United States to govern over. And that was in exchange for various things, health, education, and so forth, and security in our lands, security in our homes, and the help and the cooperation and continued friendship of the United States. So we don't want to get into a situation where we're saying, okay, well, you don't like that, then give us the planes back.
Okay, all right. Rick.
And I think people, I'm sorry, but people don't understand the difference between our behaviors as peoples, as nations, as governments, and our behaviors and our rights and responsibilities as people of color, as women, as men, as children, all, and cross-culturally and cross-generationally individuals with voting rights and other kinds of rights. So they're very different things, and I think people get confused about that. Mm-hmm. But that's the kind of thing that the Smithsonian and the Museum of the American Indian and the other museums do so well.
Right.
Try to get that information out and correct these misunderstandings.
Right. And Rick, I'd like you to chime in as well here, because given its location in both Washington, D.C. and New York, obviously NMAI has a huge role in exposing people to Native culture and history and providing this information and providing this history, this education that Suzanne mentions. Where do you think it fits, NMAI, in the overall marketplace of ideas that go into informing the public about Native America?
One of the great centers of it. I don't want to claim too much, but I have certain feelings about that. Having, along with Suzanne and many other very distinguished people from our community, help found the place, I think it's a source of immense amounts of information about that. And that's what I meant a few moments ago when I indicated that the National Museum of the American Indian is not only a museum that addresses the subject of Native history in this country. It is really looking at American history and trying to tell you stories about and to interpret that very particular piece of this history, which I think was unknown to many people in the public previously. But through instruments like the National Museum of the American Indian in both Washington and New York City, has become available as a resource and a powerful educational resource to tell these stories from all vantage points so that the people who are hearing those stories have a much better perception and a much more complete understanding of the stories of American history, and particularly the thread of that experience in history that relates to the Native past.
We have Rick West and Suzanne Schoen Harjo speaking with us today on Native America Calling. We're going to take another short break. We're going to come back and we're going to pivot a little bit, and we're going to talk about perspectives on Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's announcement that the U.S. Cavalry soldiers who took part in the Wounded Knee Massacre will keep their medals of honor. And to do that, we will bring O.J. Seamans Sr. into the conversation. And of course, we've got the phone lines open for any of you who would like to join this conversation. Share your thoughts, share your insights, share your perspectives, or just ask a question. You can do that by calling 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Pick up that phone. We want to hear from some listeners. 1-800-99-NATIVE.
The annual Indian Nations Conservation Alliance National Conference in Las Vegas, October 14th to the 16th, is a movement. Natural resource management, conservation and land stewardship, agricultural technology and innovation. Internationally acclaimed regenerative rancher Alejandro Carrillo will speak on ancestral land practices and sustainable food systems. Info and registration at inca-tcd.org. Inca supports this show.
You're tuned in to Native America Calling. The Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 remains an appalling event for the Lakota. U.S. Army soldiers opened fire with machine guns and other weapons on a group of mostly elders, women, and children, killing as many as 300. 20 of those soldiers were given the highest military honor for their efforts. President Joe Biden ordered a review of those medals last year. The current Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, just announced those medals of honor will stand. What do you think about that? Call us, 1-800-996-2848. Let's hear part of Secretary Hegseth's announcement that he posted in a video.
Under the previous administration, a review panel was convened to determine whether soldiers awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions at the Battle of Wounded Knee should keep their medals. Now, upon deliberation, that panel concluded that these brave soldiers should, in fact, rightfully keep their medals from actions in 1890. The report was concluded in October of 2024. Yet, despite this clear recommendation, former Secretary Lloyd Austin, for whatever reason, I think we know he was more interested in being politically correct than historically correct, chose not to make a final decision. Such careless inaction has allowed for their distinguished recognition to remain in limbo until now. Under my direction, we're making it clear without hesitation that the soldiers who fought in the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890 will keep their medals. And we're making it clear that they deserve those medals. This decision is now final, and their place in our nation's history is no longer up for debate. We salute their memory, we honor their service, and we will never forget what they did.
That was Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. And let's now talk with O.J. Seamans Sr. He is on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, where he is the co-executive director of Four Directions Vote. And O.J., thank you again for joining the show. We just heard the recording there from the Defense Secretary making the announcement that the debate over these medals is over. That's it, according to him. How do you feel about that? Is the debate over as far as you're concerned?
Well, it may be over for him, but it's not for natives throughout Indian country. Basically, one of the first things I want to say is that he made a decision based upon a flawed panel that was created to have this outcome. And it was July to October that this panel was in place, which basically had 3 military personnel and 2 natives on it. And that report that the Department of Defense will not give out to anybody, because we put in Freedom of Information Act requests that were denied, he's waving it all over. But the report isn't just 100%. It was the 3 military personnel saying that the medal should be kept and the 2 natives that said it shouldn't be kept. And one of the things that's really important about this panel, they didn't use any historians. They ignored information. The historians that reached out were experts on the Wounded Knee Massacre that looked into how they violated the rules, laws, and regulations way back then during the Wounded Knee Massacre. So, yeah, it may be over for him, but he also has to remember it was President Trump that actually got 4 Directions involved when he made the comment about Pocahontas at Wounded Knee. And we became very involved. We wrote them letters back in February of 2019 to President Trump, and then we wrote it to the Armed Services Committee, and they remained silent. Nobody answered anything. They didn't do anything. And so now we jump here to 2025, and they say they made a decision. But again, I think he made a decision on misinformation. But I can tell you one other thing that natives are really good at. When it comes to Congress and administrations, we are usually the only entity that can get political parties to do something nonpartisan. And at this time, what you have is Secretary Hegseth marching in lockstep with Secretary Austin and President Biden. So, I mean, this is the first time since the election where they've actually agreed on something. Unfortunately, it was wrong, but that's something natives are used to, and we will continue to carry this forward in Congress, and we will continue to educate Americans on a true history of the massacre that the women and children there at Wounded Knee.
OJ, how do you feel about the semantics that were used by Secretary Hegseth? He referred to it as a battle as opposed to a massacre. And it is true that about 24 soldiers, U.S. soldiers, were killed during that event. But do you think it warrants being described as a battle as opposed to a massacre?
Well, you know, it took us 100 years to get the United States to admit that it was a massacre. And in 1990, Congress did a joint resolution declaring it a massacre because of all the information that they were given. And so him decrying that it was a battle is totally opposite of what our Congress has said, what the United States has said since 1990. And, you know, emphasizing it as a battle. If you consider killing women and children, and you know, I guess one of the really important things that to start this out with is looking at the general in charge at the time of this massacre. And he was a Civil War veteran that went through, you know, the Civil War and seen mass maiming and murdering throughout that war. And when he showed up, he said this: about 200 women and children were killed and wounded, women with little children on their backs, small children with powder burned by the men who killed them, being so near to the burn, the flesh, as to burn the flesh and clothing with the powder of their guns, and nursing babies with bullet holes through them. Now, if he considers that a battle, then I really differ from him, because even back then, they had code that you would not take and have collateral damage such as this. And I don't know if he knows what the word or the meaning of battle is, but he's totally wrong on that aspect.
Mm-hmm. OJ, have you heard anything from any of the survivors, or I should use the word descendants of any of these soldiers that received these medals? Because even after the event occurred, even after Wounded Knee, there were soldiers who were worried they were going to get court-martialed. They thought for sure they were going to get in trouble, and then here they were honored. Have you heard anything from any of the descendants of these families?
Well, not from the descendants of the soldiers, but I have heard over and over from the descendants of the Wounded Knee survivors and those that didn't survive that really consider this so heartbreaking, such an atrocity being honored in a way that it came out through that video. But you're right. I mean, even back then, the soldiers were very worried. I mean, the Articles of War, going back to the Revolutionary War, stated that officers were responsible for their subordinates and their actions. And by the killing of those men, women, and children, they violated that Articles of War. And then there was a Lieber Code that was in place. And it was basically saying you can't create collateral damage unless it's military necessary, a necessity. And even then, if you look up military necessity, it says you do not kill women and children. I mean, it's just so outrageous that we have to keep on doing this. But here's one light at the end of the tunnel. His comments in those of the memos in the panel, it opened this door up for us to start educating America. And I can tell you there are a few that say history's over, it shouldn't move on. But I can tell you that if we're able to continue this conversation and to point out these atrocities and to reach out to, one of the things we're going to do is reach out to retired veterans now. We're going to talk to them about this. But this opens the door for us to re-educate America on the true history and the massacre there.
Okay. Suzanne, I want to bring you back into the conversation because I think we mentioned this a little bit earlier in the show, but you were involved about 35 years ago in efforts to get an apology from the federal government for the Wounded Knee massacre. Can you talk about what went into making that apology possible?
Well, part of it was, now you have to understand that the Senate, it was a congressional apology for the United States for the Wounded Knee massacre. And that's a settled matter, that it was a massacre. So I think the Secretary of Defense needs to take a look at defense records. When we needed, and we being the Wounded Knee Survivors Association and the Gray Eagle Societies, chapters of Cheyenne River and Pine Ridge needed to. They really wanted the apology, and they accepted, because every senator went to the floor who sponsored the apology and said, "This is an apology," even though it didn't say apology, it said deep regret. But it is the apology. That's what everyone passed, what they thought they were passing when they cast their vote for it. So Mario Gonzalez, the Oglala Sioux tribal attorney, long-term, and myself were representing them. I was the Washington rep, and Mario was their longtime attorney. And we set up meetings at the Department of Defense because they had to approve the apology. They had to approve the U.S. calling it a massacre and not a battle. And what they had concluded was, through their fact-finding, was, yes, a lot of the people there, the soldiers, were drunk. A lot of them were hungover, that the Native people had been disarmed, and so how can you not look at that as a massacre? And then other things that happened after that. I mean, the mass grave was dug by everyone, and the bodies were put into the mass grave, and people jumped on the top of them to mash them down. Their frozen bodies to mash them down in so they would all fit into the mass grave. And those are facts. Those are facts of history and observation and eyewitnesses, and that have been documented on the military side, the Army side, and the victims side. And the Department of Defense people were with us the whole way, and they said that they had a problem with one thing. They could understand why Sitting Bull, like people would go after Sitting Bull's people, but why Bigfoot or Chief Spotted Elk? They call him Bigfoot. And the Wounded Knee Survivors Association and the Gray Eagle Society representatives said, well, because he was the brother, they're still mad about the 7th Cavalry. They're still mad about Little Bighorn, which was a battle and not a massacre. So all of those things together made it so understandable that, yes, it was, the drunken, disorderly, and hungover, and people with their blood up and that sort of thing. So that's why they agreed to it being a massacre, and that it should be apologized for.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. OJ, I want to go back to you as we begin to wind down the show. And earlier, you suggested that this event here, it could open the door to begin educating America. And I would imagine that's where the next steps lie here, is in educating. But I also want to ask you, OJ, do you think this is going to work? All of this gaslighting that we're seeing of Native history and other, what the administration refers to as woke ideology. I mean, are you worried that in 20 or 30 years, Americans will have no knowledge of events like Wounded Knee, or no knowledge of events like the Trail of Tears, or no knowledge of events like the Lakota warriors who were hung in Minnesota? Do you think this is going to work, what the administration is attempting to do?
No. And they can play around all they want during this administration, but we are resilient. As long as there is a 7th generation coming, we will always have somebody at the forefront to take and give this message. And again, it's for the healing, really, of the descendants of the Wounded Knee Massacre. This is something that morally America should grasp. As far as, them trying to erase everything, actually what they're doing is they're bringing it to more attention to it and making people realize, because some people didn't realize about the Wounded Knee Massacre. Some people didn't realize about some of the statues that are being put back or replaced. This is opening people's eyes to something they may not have known about before, but it gives us an opening to, as I said before, to educate them, not just this year, the next year. And even when we get those medals removed, we will continue to educate them. And the Smithsonian, that is so important. And I've been there, and you actually get a really good feeling when you're there just looking at the history. And it's complementary to this government in this United States. So we're not doing anything wrong. We are doing what we call seeking the truth and putting the truth spotlight on that truth. So I'm very comfortable of moving forward regardless of what is being said at this time. To me, it's opening their eyes.
All right. We're out of time. We're going to have to wrap it up. Big thanks to Rick West, Suzanne Harjo, and O.J. Seaman Sr. Please join us again tomorrow. You've been listening to Native America Calling. Have a great day.
Hamitaki piki. Wakiganaki sneo, once agni which egwayo, Wakanjaki isham, which was on Ihapiktelo, or which agua Echakiganakapo, Lechel Zani Nipiktelo. Isamasolati Hunter Lilayo, healthcare.gov, na covers Nishlil, Wawokie, OTLIO, Lewot Haniki, Medicare, and Medicaid, or Titahiapelo.
The Association on American Indian Affairs invites all to Tribal Museums Day, December 6th through December 12th. Tribal museums may offer no-cost or reduced admission, gift shop discounts, art markets, and live cultural demonstrations. Tribal Museums Day honors diverse Native nations as the experts of their own cultures. You can find a map of tribal museums and more at indian-affairs.org/Tribal Museums Day. The association supports this show.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.